Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Agnes Rennie. I'm Vice Chair of Community Land Scotland and currently Chair of Uras Oireach Housing, the Golson Community Trust here in the north of Lewis. Today's webinar is being organised by Community Land Scotland as part of an occasional series of Meet the Pioneers, and we have a number of pioneers with us today on our panel. Very quickly, as we will be coming back to them later to give a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, but our panel today are Maggie Mackay, solicitor with Anderson MacArthur and Co in Stornoway, Sandra Holmes, Head of Community Assets at HIE, Highlands and Islands Enterprise in Inverness, Donald McKinnon, Manager with Uras Oireach Carloway, that's the community-owned estate in Carloway, and past President of the Scottish Crofters Federation, and Ian McKeever, Factor with Stornoway Trust, and currently a Crofting Commissioner for our area here in the islands. This afternoon, we'll be exploring a number of questions that frequently come up when community ownership is being discussed in the context of crofting land and crofting communities. The first part of the session will cover a number of topics in conversation between myself and the panel, and we'll then open it up and take as many of your questions as we can that I hope will have been coming in using the question and answer facility that you'll have seen on the screen as you've joined us. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today. It'd be really very little point in having a webinar of this kind if it wasn't for an audience along with us. So I hope you find today useful. I hope you find an opportunity to ask your questions or that you benefit from somebody else's questions and some of our discussion. We're also at the end or in the course of today, if you want to leave some thoughts with us, ask any questions for us to follow up and come back on later, we'll certainly look at these and do our best to follow them up. And finally, I'd also just like to say we will try and avoid today getting into the nitty-gritty of particular community questions. The panel, as you will understand, we can reflect on our own experience and we'll be doing that in the course of today. But questions applying particularly to specific areas at the moment, we will probably try and avoid getting into these too much. So just before I get the panel to introduce themselves, we'll probably take about half an hour in the initial conversation, and then we'll have about another half hour to take your questions and explore some of the things that you would like some discussion on. So first of all, can I go to Ian McKeever? Ian, can you give us a couple of minutes, or does it have to be even 2 minutes, to tell us a little about your own involvement in today's topic?
Well, difficult to know where to start. As you said, I'm the Factor of the Stornoway Trust. I'm also Racing's Clerk, active crofter, and born and brought up in the Scottish Crofters Union. And that took me to the length and breadth of the crofting counties. So helped me get a great understanding of what the issues were in different places. I was in community development with the council for another 11 years. And again, that gave me a good insight of how communities worked and how they didn't work, challenges that they face from area to area, from place to place. And I became Factor of the Stornoway Trust 30 years ago, was a founding member of Community Land Scotland, and again, through that role, got a good understanding of what the issues were. And the interesting thing was that along all that period, things hadn't changed an awful lot. the confidence, not just to move forward, but to have confidence in each other to take things forward, I think is one of the challenges that people have to face up to when they are looking at taking control into their own hands.
Thanks very much, Ian. Donald, can I move to you?
Thanks, Agnes. I'm Donald McKinnon. I'm a crofter from Arnall in the Isle of Lewis, and I'm here today as the development manager of the other side of Carloway Estate Trust. We're a community-owned crofting estate of 11,500 acres in Lewis. We've got around 200 crofting tenants and involved in various other community development activities in the estate since it was purchased back in 2015. As Agnes said, I've also got previous involvement with the Scottish Crofting Federation. I was the chair, and I'm still involved in the organisation. I have a particular interest in the future of agricultural policy and how that's going to affect crofting, how crofters can be represented in that. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Donald. Sandra?
Thanks, Agnes. I'm Sandra Holmes, and I work for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. My role involves supporting communities to acquire and to manage land and buildings. I've been in this role a long time, and over that time I've supported a number of communities to buy out crofting estates, dating back to the purchase of North Harris Estate by the North Harris Trust in 2003. Part of my job involves delivering the Scottish Land Fund alongside lottery colleagues on behalf of Scottish Government. And the Scottish Land Fund is usually the principal funder for supporting community buyout projects. On a personal note, I was assigned my mother's croft in Lochalsh back in 2001, and I sit on our local grazings committee. And finally, for me, I suppose my croft and my job are quite closely linked. It was the croft that gave me the driver to return to Lochalsh, and it was the job with High that enabled me to do it. Thanks, Agnes.
Thanks, Sandra. And to yourself, Maggie.
Thank you, Agnes. Good afternoon. I'm Maggie Mackay. I'm a solicitor and director with Anderson MacArthur Solicitors in Stornoway. We specialise in crofting law. I am not a crofter. I think my family members would definitely make sure I'm clear that I'm not a crofter, but I am certainly had my member of the crofting community, and I have certainly had my fair share of participation in crofting activities over my lifetime. I know how to chase a sheep or how to do the basics, but you wouldn't ask me to do too much more than that. In my professional life, before actually I became a solicitor, I was one of the first directors of Urasaira Housing, Galston Estate Trust, before and including the time of the buyout in 2007. And then I left the directorship then to take on my legal traineeship with Anderson MacArthur and learned from the late Simon Fraser, who was my supervisor for my traineeship. Very fortunate to learn a lot from him in terms of land reform and crofting matters. I have myself been involved in at least 3 community buyouts since Simon retired and then passed away. But certainly we act for a lot of the community land crofting community trusts and in the Highlands and Islands, and certainly have quite a lot of experience of what it means post-buyout for those communities as well.
Thanks very much, Maggie. So a panel, as you can see, reflecting a wide spectrum of experience and interest in crofting community buyouts across the Highlands and Islands. So maybe starting to yourself first, Ian, not least because of all the trusts that we have now. Stornoway Trust was 100 years ago, really bucking the trend when Lord Leverhulme passed the land to the community. Without going into the history of that, Ian, I wonder if Stornoway Trust now, 100 years later, looks back on these 100 years with satisfaction, with a sense that it was an opportunity to be relished and certainly not one to be missed.
Right, it's an interesting question. With satisfaction, To a degree, yes, in that it vindicated Lord Leverhume's decision and trust in the community to manage the land. 100 years later, yes, the trust was still there. Degree of frustration in that happened maybe before the rest of the world was ready for it, and there was no support mechanisms. So in order to basically survive and develop what the trust was expected of the trust, they had to, like Lord Leverhulme, take a very altruistic approach. And because the trust didn't have the money to develop, they made it easier for others, the local businesses, the local authority, land for development, land for housing, allowed businesses to grow. So again, satisfaction in that worked, but frustration in that it was an opportunity lost had the support been there, because in order to survive, the trust had to dispose of many of its assets. At that time, there were liabilities, and in order to free up the money that was required to maintain the trust, these liabilities, lands and buildings, were disposed of at very nominal rates at that time, and disappointing 100 years on, or almost coming up to 100 years on at the time, that these same assets were then exchanging hands between agencies for at times 7-figure sums when they were acquired for payments of double figures, and that level of benevolence was not passed on to or recognized, and the trust did not gain anything as a result. But I think the point is that it's important that in today's world, with agencies and lotteries and various other funding, that communities are allowed to develop without having to sell their assets in order to survive. The trust did it, but that doesn't mean to say that others today would be able to do the same.
Thanks, Ian. There's a couple of things there which I'd probably like to come back to in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to turn to yourself now, Donald, because in the group that we have around the table today, Urasaura Chalwai is the youngest of the trusts represented, and in a way, I'd like to ask you that same question. You know, in the short life of Urasaura Chalwai, is there a sense of satisfaction that a community ownership is giving you an opportunity as a community to take a different handle on things than would otherwise have been the case?
Thanks, Agnes. Yes, I definitely would say that there is a sense of satisfaction and a sense in this community that the community made the right decision to take forward community ownership and to purchase the estate back in 2015. But coming up to our 10-year anniversary next year, I think there probably is a sense of frustration as well, that maybe we're not as far forward as we would like to be at this point. And I think that's just a lesson that probably most trusts have to learn at some point, is that these things won't come easily and they won't come quickly. You know, that it's a slow process to set up an organization and to get that organization to where you want it to be. And for us, that's one of the key aims is financial sustainability and being able to generate enough income from the estate to make sure that we are able to employ a staff team and manage that estate. And we're probably not quite there yet, and we're quite honest in being able to admit that, you know, that there's still a challenge there for us in terms of continuing to generate or develop income generating assets for the trust. In that time, you know, we've moved around in terms of where our focus has been. Initially, it was very much on renewables and trying to find a way of developing a renewable income source on the estate that we haven't been able to realise that for various reasons, but we haven't given up on it, and we're still working away on that. But our focus in terms of income generation has really moved now to tourism and looking at how we can harness the power of the amount of visitors that are coming to our part of the island, to try and retain as much value from that as possible for the community. So we're developing the visitor centre at the Broch, and we're hoping that that's going to create real opportunities for the trust and for the community as a whole. And within that as well, we've also got an increasing focus on land management too, how we actually work with our crofting tenants on the estate to manage the land. And a lot of the initial steps on that have been around peatland restoration, which maybe we can come on to later. But dipping our toe in the water of that, and I think that's going to be an increasing topic of conversation for many of the crofting communities, but also for a lot of the crofting landlords in the Outer Hebrides. But just finally, just now, I think one of the most satisfying things over the past over this initial period of ownership of the estate for our community has been the emerging collaboration between community landowners here in the Outer Hebrides. Obviously, that the Community Land Scotland led that for many years, and then in more recent years we were able to set up Community Land Outer Hebrides to collaborate more locally. But even in a smaller way with our neighbouring estates, we are increasingly finding ways of working together, sharing resources, pooling resources, so that we can possibly take forward bigger projects in the future, do more together, and that's becoming and emerging to be quite a powerful thing, and it's quite exciting what that might lead to in the future.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Donald. I want to move now to starting with yourself, maybe first, Sandra. There are 2 or 3 things that will often come up when a community is beginning to move on community ownership. Absolutely, Carloway will have been confronted with some of these questions. Stornoway probably not, because the situation was so different, but yet I suspect they may well have been to some extent. And that is, crofters will often ask, how is this going to affect me? You know, I'm a crofter. 1886 Crofting Act gave us rights as crofters. Is this now something that's going to change our status in that regard? And I'll come to you after we've heard from Sandra, Maggie.
Yeah, thanks, Agnes. I'll leave the legislation side of things to Maggie. But I suppose just looking back, Agnes, I've had the benefit of attending quite a number of community buyout meetings and village halls, often very much at the outset of the potential of a community buyout happening in a community. And I think it's fair to say, and I went to a lot of these meetings with David Cameron from North Harris Trust. We're doing a double act up and down, mainly the Western Isles. But my impression initially is that I think there's quite a bit of concern sometimes from within crofting interests. And I suppose that's pretty understandable. Change is something is quite difficult to get your head around, particularly when something hasn't been sort of in the offing for some time. And if change is happening to you, it's just natural to feel a bit uncomfortable about it. And on one level, you know, a crofter doesn't have control normally over who the incoming landlord might be. If a landowner is changing or moving on or giving up ownership of an estate, that's entirely up to him or her to do that. And for a community and then for crofters within the community, there isn't normally any sort of agency over who that incoming landowner is going to be. So on one thing, it's just, I suppose, that's just the nature of things. But on another level, a community landowner, I'm guessing, can feel quite different, much closer to home than an absentee or a single individual who's perhaps living in the community. So I feel that whilst some of the concerns from within the crofting community are often raised in the initial early discussions, and that's very understandable, my experience undoubtedly has been that over time, once the idea becomes more familiar and once there's more meetings and more engagement of the whole community and particularly crofters within the community, and the balance that have taken place where the crofter vote has been differentiated from the wider community vote, has shown that crofters on the whole do get behind the buyout. And as we've come to see over many of the crofting estates, there's actually quite good representation, if not strong representation, of crofters on the board that actually manages the activities if the buyout comes to pass.
And just on that one, Sandra, I think it's fair to say that there is no one actual solution to these. These, you know, how Stornoway manages that, how Carloway manages that, how we ourselves in Godson manage that, will all be different, but they'll all be in deference to the legislation that exists to protect the right of the crofter.
Yes, without a doubt. I mean, a change of land ownership does not change anything in terms of crofting rights. So it's a different landowner, and I'll maybe let Maggie to come and talk a wee bit more about the legislation side of things.
Okay, Maggie, over to you. And not so much the kind of wider legislation. I think here specifically, that, as you know yourself, you'll have heard it raised, you'll have heard the questions asked, you know, is this going to make my situation different?
Yes, and I absolutely agree with everything that everyone has said on that, because it is different in every community. But with every buyout, you do get crofters asking, you know, what that's going to mean for their rights. And then the important point that Sandra touched on there is that actually the crofters' rights are secure rights under the Crofters Scotland Act 1993, but you know, as you said yourself, emanating originally from the 1886 Act, you know, there are secure rights there, and no matter who the landlord of the estate is, the crofters' rights are protected in that way, and they have, you know, they can't be you know, circumvented or restricted by a community landlord any more than they can be by a private landlord. And certainly a lot of I mean, Carloway was probably a little bit different in its buyout because the landlord was looking to sell and offered it to the community, you know, rather than kind of others where there had to be an approach from the community to buy from a private landlord. So I suppose in the situation, perhaps Carloway didn't get it as much because the landlord was going to sell, and I think that's important. They could have ended up with a private landlord who, you know, the situation would have been, you know, very much an unknown. Whereas a lot of the feedback on other buyouts, and I remember it with Golson, when I was a director, was, you know, why are we going to buy the land? Because we're quite happy with our crofting landlord. They've never bothered us. So why would we bother, you know, wanting to become the owners of the land? So yeah, you get it all the time, but certainly a big part of that is, we find as well with buyouts, is crofters start to think about exercising their right to buy their individual crofts if they have a tenancy, because they believe that that's, you know, that's the answer to ensure they don't have to become involved with this new landlord that's coming onto the scene. And the important point from that is, even if you buy your croft, you're still subject to the same regulation, same rights, same Regulations Crofting Commission. You have the same secure rights, of course, as well, as a crofter, but you don't get the benefit then if you're not part of the community, the crofting community. You don't get to be a part of the wider ownership of the crofting estate, which is, as we've heard from Yang and from Donald, you know, something that'd be a huge benefit, wider benefit than just having your individual croft. You can be part of a, you know, a development of the overall crofting estate then as well.
And so, Maggie, just on that one, the individual's situation should remain unchanged. If anything, let's be honest, in probably nearly all, most of the examples that we know, things like processing applications that might previously, depending on the spirit of the landlord, could have taken a very long time to process. At least when the community structure is in place, there's a will to make these things happen in a timely kind of way, to be supportive.
Yeah, and there's an accountability, because you know, as a crofter, you're probably going to be a member of the community trust that is the landlord. So you're therefore going to be able to hold your landlord much more accountable from 2 points of view, from the point of view of being the crofter, the croft tenant, and also from the point of view of being a member of that trust who owns the land. So there's definitely a benefit, and you should avoid the situation where I'm aware there are some landlords, private landlords, who try to propose prices for plots of land that are not in keeping with the crofting legislation and are much higher than they should be. And you should also be avoiding that, because again, you've got the accountability on the community trust to act properly and in the best interests of its members, which a private landlord, as much as they're regulated by the legislation, is not going to be accountable in the same way unless you take them to the land court to do so. I'm not saying you wouldn't, perhaps in some cases, or there will be some crofters who want to take their community land owner to the land court as well, but you should have much more accountability if everybody's keeping to the law. You should have much more accountability between the crofter as a member of the trust and the trust itself in that situation.
Thanks, Maggie. I think that takes us.
Can I just add
yes,
something?
certainly come in. Yeah.
Sorry, it boils down to that if you have a good landlord, there isn't a huge deal of difference at crofting level from having a good private landlord or a community landowner. But if you have a bad landowner, read about what the community needs or feels or wants. Crofters exposed to that type of landlord are in a very vulnerable position under the Act. And it's that vulnerability I think is the biggest driver of all to take land under your own control.
It's a very good point here. Very good point. I think it just in that regard, the difference between the individual and the community. As crofters, we are part of the community, and undoubtedly the legislation, when it was drafted, reflected on the community aspect of it. Sandra, when you are in your day-to-day role and responding to communities looking to actually take on the ownership of the land, that is, if it's just a continuation of what is there already, there is little point in doing it. So HIE and other funders will be looking very much to an indication that the community group is looking to bring improvement. How do you look for that? And how do you encourage the community to look for that?
Yes, without a doubt, public funding, whether it's from HIE or the Scottish Land Fund or anywhere else, is looking to add benefits and adding value. So we wouldn't look to support something if the status quo was just going to carry on. So when we're looking at prioritising our funding, because the reality is there's never enough funding for all the demands that are on it, we need to look at the impact that a proposal is going to make. And when it comes to larger estate buyouts and crofting estates within that, we look at a number of things in terms of the community support for the overall buyout proposals. We look to see about the capacity within the organisation to give us confidence that the proposals can be delivered by the owning entity. And fundamentally, I suppose most importantly, we look at what we think the difference that a change in community landowner or the land coming into community ownership is going to make. And we look at this in this sort of short, medium, and essentially in the longer term. So that's quite a lot of work to do. And it's from a standing start, it might feel very onerous and quite a significant undertaking. So there is support to help communities to work through sort of feasibility studies and business planning, getting outside help to do some specialist studies if the estate has some buildings on it or certain elements where the community feel that expertise would be helpful. And I think one thing that I really take a lot of joy in terms of my own role and working within the community land sector is the wider support from other communities that have been there and done it. Frequently, existing community landowners will reach out to support organisations and communities that are going through the process. So tends to be that there's quite a lot of work to be done, and these things don't happen overnight. And quite rightly, you need to take the time that is required to take forward an application for funding, wherever that may be, from when the community is ready and that the community is behind the overall aspirations. And essentially, as I was saying, we look at the overall thing, but we do look at community support, community outcomes, and looking at change. And we're looking at change on a number of fronts, but essentially it's all about change to people and the circumstances of people. So anything that we would feel would strengthen the community is essentially the main metrics that we would be looking to assess.
Thanks, Sandra. Donald, you touched earlier on how your own trust in Carlow is looking increasingly now at tourism and the opportunities that tourism might bring to create income streams. You also touched on your probably biggest asset of all that you have, and that's the peatlands that run as part of your estate. Do you want just to say a wee bit more maybe how you are now beginning to explore these, and then whilst in fact they probably didn't feature to the fore to that extent when the original business plan was being drawn up?
No, that's absolutely right. It wasn't really on the horizon at that point. But we had the opportunity a number of years ago to begin a relationship with Nature Scot and the Peatland Action Programme in hosting a Peatland Action Officer covering the whole of the Outer Hebrides. So as a trust, we've had an insight into peatland restoration from quite an early stage in the process. And that's been helpful. It's probably created more questions than answers for me, and I spend a lot of time discussing this with colleagues and crofters, other members of the community on how best we should approach this and progress with it. To date, what we've done as a trust is worked with One Grazing's shareholders in particular, and in collaboration with Scottish Water, we've seen peatland restoration carried out on the estate so far. That's all been either mostly funded by Scottish Water to date, and has been very focused on improving water quality for a drinking reservoir that feeds the whole of most of the west coast of Lewis. And in the process, the crofters on that grazings have supported the development that's happened there. They've seen improvements to access across their grazings mostly. Some of the restoration techniques lead to creating effectively dams and bunds across water networks that previously would have been quite hazardous when gathering sheep or moving sheep across them. So importantly, we haven't removed stock from any of these areas. These continue to be used for agricultural purposes. What we haven't done to date is engage in carbon markets. There's still some big question marks around how crofting communities can engage in generating carbon credits and registering projects with the Peatland Code. To date, I'm not aware that any have registered, that any projects have been registered with the Peatland Code on common grazings. If anybody is aware, please let me know, because I would be very interested to hear. But that's our understanding at the moment. And personally, I think we do still have to approach these things with caution. But what is really important is that crofting communities are able to engage in these things, are able to make that choice. And at the moment, I don't think that choice is available. And that's what we need to see change. Now, whether community land trusts or the crofting shareholders do want to engage in these things in the future is a separate question, but they should have the ability to do so. But increasingly, we're going to see more and more debate and questions around the approach.
Sorry, Donald, just for a second, just for clarity for those listening, why do you think crofting communities are not able to engage in that at the moment?
So it's to do with finding a mechanism for how you'd actually go about reaching an agreement between the different parties involved to then generate to register a restoration scheme with the Peatland Code, and then subsequently generate the carbon credits. So that would lead to you having to have an agreement between the landlord and the crofters, which there's some ideas that may be possible using some mechanisms that exist within the legislation, the current legislation. But there's also a school of thought that thinks that some tweaks to that legislation would help would help clarify the position to make sure that all parties are protected. The really important thing about generating, if you generate carbon credits, is the integrity of those credits and ensuring that all parties are in agreement about what has been created and who can extract value from that. And there's a big moral debate about engaging in that, but getting those practicalities straightened out is a really important step in that to begin with.
Before I go, thanks, Donald, that's really helpful. I'm going to go to Ian, but I see a look of interest on Sandra's face, and I'm looking to see if she's got something a nugget to offer us at the moment.
I'm not sure if that was a look of interest, but I think Donald has covered it off really well. It's a really complicated area. There's lots of work, it's fair to say, going on behind the scenes, both within Scottish Government and the Crofting Commission. There's a crofting bill consultation out just now that's got a couple of questions about probably looking to facilitate the passage of agreements between crofting tenants and the crofting landlord to enable investment, if that's deemed to be appropriate. I think the challenge with natural capital works on crofting land is that you've got the landowner in one sense, and you've also got the crofters in another sense. And both of these two interests have to come together for anything to work on the land. Currently, to take an application forward for carbon credits, it's only a landowner that can do that. So crofters on their own can't take forward an application to the woodland code or the crofting or the peatland code. And I think it will be helpful for some work to happen behind the scenes just to try and facilitate I suppose it's the route map, how to get all of this to happen on crofting. I think I try, and I agree with Donald that there are lots of considerations. I think I try myself to keep an open mind because I think there's opportunities here as well. We've got a vast crofting resource, and a lot of the natural capital in the Highlands and Islands is on land that's under crofting tenure. And I think the real prize in this is to facilitate these route maps where the benefits of the carbon and any monetary benefits that might flow from that actually stays within the communities in which it's generated. And that's very much the position that Scottish Government is in, is looking for a responsible market in carbon. And although at the moment we're talking a lot about carbon, in the future there'll be wider benefits to do with soil quality, water quality, biodiversity, etc., etc. So it's an evolving area, one to keep a close eye on. I don't think in terms of crofting we're quite there yet in terms of being able to tiptoe your way through all the rules and the regulations to make it all stack up. Thanks,
Sandra. Ian, you've been in your current role for quite a number of years now, and I suppose one way of looking at the carbon related opportunity at the moment is it has come almost out of nowhere. But over the years, there have been many such opportunities. Have we as crofting communities, do you think, and has your own trust been able to respond to these in a way that has allowed you to benefit?
The last part of the question, no, for the reasons that have already been well stated. It reminds me very much of when the Forestry Act came in, and I think Sandra put her finger on one of the problems. It's happening behind the scenes, and if it was including and had included crofters and input from the crofting community, then the impasse on both carbon credit and carbon code has been as big an issue as it is now, because crofters have rights through their tenure, and there appear to be no cognizance of crofters' interests or crofters' rights in the setting up of the carbon code, from what I've been able to understand. I've been at many a meeting and seminars and still haven't had an answer that would even go anywhere near satisfying my concerns over what's happening. The carbon code, as Donald said, is working, but our peatland, the areas that I've travelled and walked and worked, differs from parish to parish, township to township. And in the main, the level of damage or degrading that has taken place isn't as bad as it is in certain areas. But the constraints, so the returns that you would get were like the LFA again, the less favoured area, we're probably the most disadvantaged, yet we get the poorest returns. In the same way with carbon code, you're calculated on the tonnage that you're going to save, but through years of good management and land management practices, we haven't destroyed our environment. Returns are going to be that much less. So there's less incentive in these areas. And certainly if you're tying up land for 20, 30, 100 years, that's a big ask. If it's your own land, yes, you can sign up to that and suffer the consequences if it goes wrong. But if you're the custodians of land on behalf of other people, like a grazings committee or even a community-owned estate, and you tie people into these long arrangements, no one knows what's happening tomorrow. 20 years ago, no one would have envisaged the growth in renewable energy. So you don't know what's round the corner, and tying land up with no get out isn't, to my mind, the way forward. And when you think of Lewis in the 60s and the 70s, where people had to go further away from their houses to cut peat because the in-buy had been already exhausted, these areas were reseeded and became a valuable part of crofting in these townships. These reseedings today are not emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And there is no reason why there couldn't be give and take. If you're taking from the crofters, give on the other, and then you can see progress.
Thanks, Ian. Right, moving to another perspective on this. Maggie, one of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years in particular, probably, is the price of land changing, increasing, let's be honest, in a way that we probably could hardly have imagined when, I must say, even when the estate in Golson was bought just 17 years ago. People would have looked on the kind of land where most crofting communities are as being of poor value, poor agricultural value, and therefore surrounded by legislation which made it very unattractive. For different reasons, we seem to be moving beyond that. Can you reflect maybe a little on how communities can still look at these situations? First of all, existing community trusts. How are they protected in because they are community owned now, in terms of being exposed to these increased prices? And where does this leave communities that are aspiring to become community owners themselves?
Wow. Okay.
I'm just asking you to reflect on it, by the way, not to give me an answer.
No, I know. I'm just thinking where to
Not
start.
a solution. Not a solution today.
I think it's all I suppose a lot of the changes have come as, certainly in the islands, we have had people, a lot of people moving into our communities with a bit more finances and being able to pay more. So then your values as such are dictated by the demand and the price that people are willing to pay. And I'm certainly sure that at certain stages people are paying, thinking that when they're buying a croft, for example, a croft tenancy, they think they are getting a land that they can do what they like with and don't appreciate the regulation around it. And it has caused an issue in terms of you have people moving into the communities, which are needed as well, because the communities have a lot of depopulation. So certainly the increase in population is welcome, but it's causing an issue in terms of the prices being achieved even for a Bearland croft tenancy is just out with the scope of young crofters being able to achieve that. And certainly there is the ability in terms of the crofting community landowners, existing and new, to be able to protect land for their community to a degree. There are a couple of certain things that come to mind. So if crofts are not being used and crofts become go through the regulation of the Crofting Commission, tenancies are terminated, there is the opportunity for crofting trusts as landlords to let those crofts to individuals, or younger crofters perhaps, who wouldn't be able to afford to buy a tenancy in the same way. There's the opportunity for landlords with the agreement of common grazing, if it is common grazing land that's going to be developed in this way, for new crofts to be created that would allow for these, individuals. I mean, I'm saying young crofters, it can be people who are maybe not so young, probably not in the young crofter category myself anymore, but certainly any crofters who are keen to have a croft, that there's the opportunity for new crofts to be created. There are certainly issues around that mechanism within the Crofting Act, but we only have this afternoon a very short period of time, so I will not start Ian or Donald discussing that either, because I think that's definitely a real challenge within the existing crofting law, how the new crofts mechanisms can be made a bit more easy for community, for any landlord actually to work through, and any tenants to be able to create new crofts in this way. Certainly as well, when land is being decrofted and sold, any landlord, whether they are private or a community one, has the ability to impose a 10-year crofting clawback. That's within the crofting legislation, and that ensures that if the crofter is taking title to the decrofted area, or a member of their family, that they're able to get it with this clawback imposed, and it means they can get it at a reduced price, at a 15 times the market, the croft rental or proportion of figure, with the crofting clawback imposed. And if that plot of land is either immediately or later being transferred to a third party who is not a member of that crofter's family, then there is a capital payment due in terms of 1/2 of the market value to the landlord, and that ensures that there's not that commercial exploitation element available to crofters or third parties, that leaving the crofting landlord with nothing, or having given away the land at a few pounds perhaps, or a few £100 at most. So there are mechanisms available to crofting trusts and landlords generally to protect the land, and certainly that's things. Certainly we're seeing a lot more appetite for landlords to do that kind of thing, and ensure that protection is in place for their members as well.
And bearing in mind all the time that when we talk about the crofting landlord, we're looking at that financial return, whatever it might be, being reinvested back in the community.
Absolutely.
Whether we're talking about croft rents or land sales or whatever, any income generated from that kind of deal is back into the community.
Because prior to the clawback being in place, I mean, the reality is that clawback was put into the law because of a lot of commercial exploitation happening. Crofters were applying to their landlords, buying a plot of land for maybe £200 or £300, and then selling it for 25,000, and there was nothing coming back into the community as such. So that clawback was put there for a reason. And there are people who will wait the 10 years, of course, and take the clawback and wait the 10 years before they then transfer it on. But most people aren't quite that patient when they see a financial return, I think.
Indeed, indeed. I'm going to come to you now, Donald, and just talk a wee bit about housing. But before I do, can I just head up, Lindsay, do we have any questions coming in?
We don't have any questions yet, but it's such an interesting subject. I'm sure someone's got a question, so if they'd like to put it in the Q&A, I'll read it out later.
We're getting all the questions between ourselves then. That's good. That gives us all the more scope to just kind of spend time on it here. Donald, so yeah, one of the hot topics, I think it's fair to say, currently amongst most community land trusts is housing. And I think it's also fair to say that when certainly the modern trusts, if we put it that way, were being created, nearly always housing was an issue, unless I'm sure Sandra will reflect on that maybe later. But what can you just share with us a little about how your own trust is becoming engaged in that discussion?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right there that housing has featured sort of top of the list, or certainly up there in the big issues whenever we consult with the community. And initial engagement pre-buyout as well highlighted that housing was something that people were interested in. We haven't had any major projects to date around housing, but it's something that we're increasingly looking at. Our engagement with housing to date has mainly been around just trying to be as constructive as possible when and proactive in identifying housing sites and trying to work with the local housing association to identify areas that could be built on. To date, we haven't had anything happen on our own land. There was some land that had previously been taken out of crofting and land banked a number of years ago that the housing association did build on in our estate, which was very welcome and we supported, but we weren't directly involved in that. What we increasingly see as being an issue around that is that building in the rural areas the rural areas of the island seems to be quite prohibitively expensive for the housing association to do at the moment, and that's prevented them taking forward any further sites in our part of the island, which is frustrating. And I think there's no one silver bullet there, but there does just need to be a lot more thought going into how we actually fund the development of social housing and affordable housing in rural communities like ours, to make sure that when sites are available and sites are offered, even if that would only result in the building of maybe 1 or 2 houses, rather than what's seen as being commercially viable now being like a 10-house development or an 8-house development being the minimum. So there's lots of funding elements in that as well. I think one of the other important points to make around housing, and it's kind of what Maggie was touching on there about land values and how we go about transactions around land, is that sometimes there's an expectation that trusts will just give land away for something like housing developments. Now, it's really important that from our perspective that we are as helpful and supportive as possible in that process in identifying land, making sure that shareholders are happy if it's common grazing land to enter into negotiations around that. But the land has a value, and it's really important for land trusts that we are consistent in that. And consistency and fairness around land values is really important. That's why, you know, the process that Maggie outlined there, and how we deal with crofters is it sort of spills over into how we would deal in commercial negotiations as well. That fairness and consistency is crucial, or else you fall into all sorts of pitfalls. But finally, just on again linking back to what Maggie been saying there, that housing and crofting communities isn't just about developing new social housing. It's about making sure that you're making it as easy as possible for the churn of crofter housing to be built as well, and that process of existing houses being decrofted, crofts being transferred onto the next generation, and them in turn building their own house on their croft is just such a crucial part of how the housing stock has been built up in our estate and in many other rural communities, crofting communities in Lewis and Harris. What we need to make sure, and this is more not on state policy, but more in wider policy, is that the support mechanisms are there in the Croft House Grant Scheme to enable that to happen and to be realised. I think the Croft House Grant Scheme has always been a very, very cost-effective way of delivering high-quality housing stock in the crofting counties, and we're starting to hear more and more people just saying that it's not quite delivering that anymore. Very, very good and very helpful for people who are able to access it, but it could be such a more powerful tool to deliver more houses, and we'd certainly like to see that strengthened, more money go into it, and make sure that it is delivering all that it could.
Thanks, Donald. Lindsay, are we getting some questions now?
We are, yes. So the first one is from Christine McKenzie, who's asking about the 10-year clawback to a landlord from a crofter. Is it mandatory that it's set at 50% and over 10 years?
Right, I'm go to you, Maggie, on that one.
Yes, so the originally when the clawback was put into the law, it was 5 years. That was the period, but that was extended in the 2010 Act to 10 years, and it's been 10 years since then. And yes, it's 50% of the market value of the site, so that doesn't include any improvements the crofter might have made to the site. So it's the value of the bare land value in effect. So if the crofter has built something on the site and is then selling within the 10-year period, or if they have got planning permission on the site or done other improvements to the site, then they would be discounted from the value, the 50% value at that stage. So that's the basics, but it's 10 years and it is 50% of the basically the bare land market value.
Just before we go to the next question, Lindsay, Ian, reflecting on sale of land for houses, around your own trust, do you think the clawback has made a difference over time?
Not really.
Not really.
No, it's for some people, it's a very short wait, and those who need to or want to sell straight away will negotiate a price, not necessarily, not nowhere near 50% of the value, but at least the landlord gets something. But the housing, well, the trust gets criticised by others for allowing houses to be built in and around Stornoway, and that's where the demand is. And most of the land around Stornoway is now been taken up by either agriculture or crofting tenancy, and it's these parcels of land that are appearing on the market. And as Donald said, there is this unfortunate presumption certainly coming through from the Housing Association that community land should give land away for free. Well, I'm not aware that they give houses away for free, so I don't. The land has a value, and it's one of the most important, or is the most important asset the community landowner or any landowner has, and it's only right that realizes its value, and then that is then injected back into the community. There is a resistance. The further you go from Stornoway, away from Stornoway, we've tried hard to gauge if there is an appetite in the townships to see housing, and when it comes to social housing, there is a resistance for various reasons. And one of the, I think, main reasons is the little land that they see left, they want to keep for their own, in the same way as they were able to get housed in their village or in their community. They don't want to deprive their successors of that opportunity. So it is difficult. But there is also a myth that if it's crofting land, it's impossible. It's not impossible. If the crofters were getting a fair price, other landowners, then I think there would be more of an appetite to it. But another big blockage now is the ruling or the interpretation of the law that crofters have to share out, and crofting townships have to share out all proceeds from a resumption. Now, in the past, with the consent of the village, these resumptions were ploughed back into making improvements to the infrastructure, the well-being of the community. But it sticks in the craw for many crofters to see land resumed and the value going, not just to inactive crofters, but to people who are far away from the croft, who have no interest coming back there, but are entitled to a share in that development. With the result that when you ask them, do they want to resume, I think there's a tendency, no, we want to keep it.
Okay, we're almost getting into the area of the nitty-gritty there, Ian, and I think I don't want to confuse those who are not quite as familiar with the nitty-gritty as we try to be anyway. But it is these are the things that crofters, crofter communities, and indeed crofting trusts are having to grapple with. The one thing I'd probably like to just comment in before we leave it is that in our own experience, I see that what the community trusts do have a capacity to do is to provide a mechanism towards trying to explore these issues and trying to find solutions which may not otherwise have been the case. Sandra.
Yeah, thanks. I'll maybe just come in, and this is me speaking in a personal capacity, and it's actually a housing development in my own township that was actually led by the crofters. So where I stay in Lochalsh, Ploughton, and our estate is owned by the National Trust for Scotland. And there's been a huge pressure on housing locally, as is everywhere at the moment. And what we've seen over the years is lots of land the crofters have given up for housing over the years has slowly gone into second home ownership, short-term lets, etc., etc. But some time ago, an opportunity came up where there was demand for housing, and the crofters were being approached. So we decided to take a bit of control over this and a bit of leadership as crofters, because we're not on a community-owned estate. Because the area of land that was being earmarked for a housing development would have required a significant chunk of our common grazings to make the costs stack up, because the cost to build in sort of PT land meant that you had to get so many houses to make your cost per unit stack up. So we looked at our crofting resource because we were sympathetic to the need for housing, and we identified an area of our common grazings that was a wee bit smaller that we felt we could give up. It wouldn't have so much impact on crofters. This area of land wasn't in the local plan, but we spoke to the planners and basically said to the housing association who were looking to do the development to exhaust the planning process before we would consider the area of land that they were keen to develop. And long story short, we got 17 crofters, all the shareholders, to agree to giving up our preferred area of land. That went through a resumption process that Ian touched upon. And the Housing Association have since built 24 units. So when I go to work in the morning, I pass a whole heap of kids going to the high school in Ploughton. That just wouldn't have happened had that not come about. And I think this is a situation where the crofters took leadership and determined a housing development that suited ourselves, but also delivered wider community benefits, because we absolutely, we're part of the community. We don't live in isolation to everyone else. And I think Croftland has an opportunity to contribute to the supply of land for housing, but if it can be done on crofting terms, that is taking cognizance of crofting needs and wider community needs, working together in partnership is more likely to deliver positive outcomes. So my experience of this, like a crofter-led housing development being developed by a housing association, has really been positive for both crofters, but mainly for the wider community of which we're all a part.
Thanks, Sandra. Lindsay, another question? Oh, sorry, Maggie, did you want to just a final word on that one?
I wanted to pick up on the clawback because there's a comment from a Julia Campbell about that, and I think that kind of takes us back to
Sorry, just before you reply to that, just in case everybody hasn't read that comment, can you just read the comment briefly?
Well, basically that the clawback system seems to have resulted in an increase of land prices in her area. For a crofter to get 40,000, they have to charge 80,000, and sort of they're about to take on the estate in Cogach. And one suggestion is that the community, as a landowner, could encourage sales and then ring fence the landowner's contribution in a housing or new crofter development fund. And hopefully crofters would feel happier about that than it disappearing into the back pocket of an absentee landowner. So I think that takes us back to the point of the clawback is in the law for all landlords, whether they are private or community trusts. And I think that takes the fact that the community would have the clawback mechanism and be able to do what there's nothing in the law that prevents them from doing what they like or ring fencing that funds once they come in for the benefit of but whatever that money that comes in is going to be for the benefit of the community as a whole, and I suppose, and not into the back pocket of an absentee landowner, as she says. So I think that probably gives even more of an incentive for communities to own their land and to use the clawback in the way it was intended.
Okay, that's useful. Thanks, Maggie. Lindsay?
The next one's a bit of a philosophical question from an anonymous attendee. Can and should community landowners, as an example to other types of landowner, be encouraged to lead the way to ensure that crofters benefit from natural capital if the crofters wish to do so? And does Community Land Scotland have a role in this along with others?
Donald, you've reflected on this quite a bit earlier. Do you have anything to add, taking this particular question?
Yeah, I've thought quite a bit about this and over the years and certainly in the last few months, and I think on balance probably yes. You know, I think that having some good examples of best practice around this will probably help. I'm just very conscious that first step into this, particularly if it was a community landowner that took it, would have to be very well thought through and would have to be best practice. You know, would have to be a process and a method that you would expect to be repeated potentially across the crofting counties. And there's a real danger if a precedent is set and it's not quite right, but it has shown that you can do this. You can register in the example of peatland restoration, you could register a peatland code project on a common grazings, and that process didn't take crofters with it, for example. That could be massively damaging, and I think that on reflection, that's the reason why you would expect that if a community landowner took it forward, that we would make sure that those problems would be avoided. I think there's also an opportunity there for the Scottish Minister's estates to explore this as well. And I know that they have been doing some work on their own estates and doing peatland restoration, scoping out some peatland restoration projects on their own estates, because for anybody who isn't aware, they are own a lot of crofting land in over a number of crofting estates. However, my understanding is that they're not looking at specifically at the code at the moment. So that would be another option for one of these best practice examples to be taken forward. But yeah, I think there definitely is a role there to make sure that this is done right from the outset.
There's a huge issue over liability once you get into the carbon code. Sell the credits, then you're the person that's going to be accountable. And if you're accountable on behalf of a community and something goes wrong and you have to pay back what you've sold, then communities could find themselves in a very bad place.
This comes back, I think, to the comments you were making earlier, Sandra, where the route map has just not been developed.
Yes, I think Donald, highlighted some of the considerations here, and Ian's absolutely right. I think anything that's new has to be very well thought through, particularly because these schemes, by the nature of them, they're not just for 5 or 10 years, as Ian was saying, it could be up to 80, 100 years. So you're actually making it, this current generation is making a decision that's going to impact on future generations. And, whilst 10, 15 years ago, we didn't quite know the scale of the opportunity to do with natural capital and carbon, who knows what might be around in, 15, 20 years beyond that. So my sense is that it's still very early days. I think there's an opportunity here where it can be, but whether it can be crystallised in the benefits of all the key stakeholders. And in terms of a community-owned estate, the key stakeholders will be the community landowner, the crofters within that, and the wider community. And who knows what's around the corner, but I think there's opportunities yet to be determined how deliverable they will be, and have to look at this in a very longitudinal lens. Is not something to look at, or another way of looking at it, there's no quick wins in natural capital benefits. These are long-term projects, and quite often the financing of it could be decades down the line before any money start to flow. So it's not something, it's very, very different to the modelling to do with renewable energy. So it's long-term, slow burn, and it's not without its risks, but there could be positive outcomes. And fundamentally, we need to look at climate change and mitigating carbon. So there's lots of positive reasons to do it. But in terms of signing your land or your estate over to a scheme would require significant thought. And you need to come to a very informed position before you commit yourself one way or the other. So I think hopefully things will get clearer. I think just now there's so many unknowns, it's difficult to take those first steps. And time will tell whether changes to the schemes or changes to crofting legislation might de-risk some of it. So I'm hopeful it will, but I just don't know at this stage.
Thanks, Sandra. Lindsay, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, we've got questions from a couple more people. So the first one is from Alana Turner, who's asking if there's a list of existing crofting communities. And I think the second question is about whether there's the potential to create crofts in the northeast of Scotland.
Is there a list of existing crofting communities per se?
Yes.
Ian, I'm assuming that the Crofting Commission has this.
Well,
Assuming that we're talking about townships, I mean,
if
communities can be interpreted in different ways.
Yeah, if we're talking about crofting communities, that's one of the big questions that's been addressing, that people have been trying to address for years, because there's a clear change in crofting practices. But at the moment, the crofting community, in the Commission's eyes, as far as I can see, is crofters who have a share in a certain grazing. That's the community. If you're outside that, then you're not part of that community. You might be in another crofting community. So to answer, is there a list? Yes, every crofting township that's on the register is technically a crofting community, and that can vary from a township of 1 or 2 to townships of 80, 90, 100 people, shareholders. But
what was the second part of the question, Lindsay?
There's about the potential to expand into the northeast of Scotland.
Oh, well.
That will require legislative change. The only expansion that was made in recent years was including part of Arran. I don't think there's been many, there hasn't been a great take-up of within Arran of crofting. The biggest problem you have in crofting at the moment is people wanting out of crofting rather than wanting in.
Just to come in on that, the Minister do have the power at the moment to designate other areas as crofting areas beyond the existing crofting counties. So that's what happened when Murray and, as Ian said, Arran and were designated as new crofting areas, and I think this issue comes up quite regularly. Other areas wanting to have the power to have crofts created in them, and I think if we think that crofting is good for the Highlands and Islands, then it's logical that you would say, well, the same system should apply to other areas of Scotland, and SCF has certainly supported that in the past. I think we do need to get our own house in order first as well. There's an element of that too, to make sure that crofting is really working in the Highlands and Islands. But I think there's particular opportunities when we talk about woodland crofts, for the model to be applied to communities in areas like the south of Scotland, southwest Scotland, where you've got a lot of forestry, a lot of concentrated patterns of land ownership there, and woodland crofts could play a really important role in creating more opportunities for people to get onto the land in those areas. So I wouldn't rule it out completely. I think it's an interesting thing to discuss and for a conversation to take place in that.
There's a lot of land within the crofting counties that's not in the crofting tenure.
That's right.
Would it be added to the crofting stock?
Yeah.
Next question, Lindsay.
Hey, apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, Susie, but this question is from Susie Stuhlinger from the Scottish Crofting Federation. Given the overheated land market, is it realistic at all for further crofting estates to be acquired by crofting communities? How would this happen, and is there a role for the existing crofting communities' right to buy?
Ooh, that's a big one. Sandra, we could spend the rest of the afternoon, if not the rest of the week, talking about this. So a simple wee reply.
That's a very interesting question. I think for a long time there hasn't really been a market in crofting estates, but we're seeing that changing just now. More recently, the last 5 years, it's been crofting estates changing hands, whereas 20 years before that, apart from communities looking to buy crofting estates, there hasn't really been much demand. And the demand for crofting estates just now undoubtedly is just tied in with the general land market, which is somewhat overheated, although I understand it's cooling off a wee bit. But there's new buyers coming into the land market in Scotland, and some of those new buyers are interested in crofting estates. So there's more of a market in the purchase of a whole estate than there has been before. The Crofting Community Right to Buy, which is legislation that was enacted in 2003 that gives communities in crofting areas, its whole communities, not just crofters within that, an opportunity to apply to ministers for a right to buy croft land. And that right to buy, importantly, can be exercised at any time. It doesn't require a willing seller. So it's essentially a form of compulsory purchase. And interestingly, and in my view, quite sadly in some respects, since this legislation came to pass all those years ago, not a single blade of grass has been purchased under the Crofting Community Right to Buy. Having said that, there have been a number of communities. Your own community, Agnes, started off on the Crofting Community Right to Buy all those years ago and negotiated a negotiated sale with the landowner. The Park Trust did likewise, and they were actually awarded a community right to buy under the legislation. So an award has been made, but in the end, the community and park negotiated different terms from what the legislation set out. So I think the Crofting Community Right to Buy has affected or has delivered positive benefits, although it's never actually been used to actually purchase any land at the moment. The question was also touching on the marketing crofts. So, or crofting estates. A crofting estate would tend to have a market value that is less than it would be if there was no crofting tenure over that land. And I don't think we've got enough information just now to see if the marketing crofts has increased the price significantly. The crofting estates that have been purchased to date largely are within the sort of hundreds of thousands. It's not into the millions of pounds, and I don't quite know exactly what the market looks like. Clearly, just now we're all aware that we're living in difficult times in terms of public funding, and public funding is going to be constrained for quite some time. So there are perhaps challenges around just now that might not have been so apparent some years ago in relation to public funding. So I think I haven't got a complete answer because we haven't got enough evidence as to what the current market value of a crofting estate is, and we haven't had a crofting community seeking to secure public funding to buy a crofting estate for some time. But I think we're working and living in a different environment to where we were 5-10 years ago. I'm always hopeful, though, if there's a good project and positive benefits can be delivered and the community is supportive, that somehow funding can be found, but it'll all be dependent on the circumstances of a case at the time it comes around.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Okay, folks, I think that's us about covered the points that I had and the questions that were raised today. I'd like to just wind up by inviting all of you, by giving you the opportunity, indeed, to end on a positive note. And that positive note is to reflect on what you think your estate, your community estate that you live on, or that you're involved with, or one that you know of, or that crofting communities generally, that community-owned crofting estates. What is the most positive thing that you think that you will pass on to the next generation? Donald, can I start with you?
Thanks, Agnes. Tough question. I think for me it's capacity. It's making sure that there are people working in these communities who are able to actually engage with and to work on these big questions that we've discussed in this webinar today, about how we can develop these communities and take them forward, and collaborate with others as well. But it's capacity for me.
Sandra?
Sorry, lost my mute button. So I work with crofting communities, and I don't live on one. But I think for me, the key thing that I think about in terms of the legacy is having a landowner that is vested in the interests of both the estate and also the community, and I suppose more importantly, the community. And can I just say that I've known Ian and Agnes for over 20 years, and we both don't look a day older than they did 20 years ago. And they've been living and breathing community ownership. So Donald, this bodes very well for the future for you.
how long did you rehearse that one, Sandra? Ian, I must come to you after that comment. I think he's struck for words. You know that, Sandra, it doesn't happen very often.
Maybe it's that mist that's still hanging around from yesterday or Saturday. Right, the legacy. Well, the first thing that gives me hope that we're going to pass it on to the future is the interest amongst the young in land and in crofting. So that in itself is a huge encouragement and something that motivates myself and others to try and make sure that the future will be as good as, if not better than, we are now. The key thing going forward for the trust and a legacy will undoubtedly be, hopefully without having to wait much further than the next 6 years, is the income and the employment opportunity that will come from renewables. That can have a transformational effect, not just on the trust, but on an island-wide basis, with employment, not just for one breadwinner, but for the household. And what that then can trigger should offer people an opportunity to go somewhere, but most importantly, to stay or return. The choice would be theirs, but in my generation, that choice wasn't there. Hopefully, in future generations, that will become the norm. And finally, the need to work together. To pinch the old Scottish Crofters Union, maybe still the federations, unity is strength. And we've seen where communities come together to buy the land, and now having bought the land, coming together to drive down good, solid deals in a united way is the way forward. And it'd be interesting to, while we're on unity, what would have happened if Leverhulme's vision of the whole island being community owned 100 years ago would have come to fruition? Where would we have been now?
Thanks, Ian. Maggie, last word on this one to you.
Oh wow, I think it's been well covered, but confidence and sustainability, I think what Yang said is correct. The young people interested in crofting, interested in their communities. We have a generation now who are working for community land trusts, certainly in the case of Galston, it immediately comes to mind, who have never known a time when it wasn't a community-owned estate, you know, and that is just, you know, really quite inspirational. They don't know a time before that, and really having the confidence as crofters, as members of the community, to be able to take your community on to the next level and develop things and have ideas and be confident in taking those forward for the benefit of everybody in the community, including the crofters.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And thank you very much indeed to all our panel today, to Ian McKeever, to Donald McKinnon, Sandra Holmes, and once again to Maggie Mackay. It's been a really interesting discussion. I hope that everybody listening in has found it useful. I hope we've covered at least some of the questions that you had an hour and a half ago. And I hope that if we haven't, that you'll certainly follow up and get in touch with us through CLS, through Community Land Scotland. Community Land Scotland exists as a result of members having set it up, community land owners having set up the organisation. It continues to work for and with community landowners, both existing landowners and those that are aspiring and interested to do so. So please make good use of the services that the organisation provides. Thank you all very much for being with us today, and looking forward to the next Meet the Pioneers.
A thank you to yourself for keeping us in order as well.
And that was the hardest job. Thank you, Ian.